As Leonard Cohen saying, hopefully, democracy is coming to the USA. And I'm proud of the extent to which my book is provoking discussion about how we got to where we are today. And everywhere I've been speaking, I'm stunned by the size of the crowd that comes out. So thank you for coming out tonight in LA. I grew up here. I know it's a commitment sometimes to come out and get from point A to point Z. And so I appreciate you being here. I have prepared some remarks. I usually kind of wing it, but I actually did some writing for you tonight. And I did because I want to talk not just about my book, but about the events of the past few days, because it's another case of here we go again. And I know how deeply distraught and dismayed many of you are, and this feeling that we just can't go through this again. So I want to begin with some prepared remarks, and then I'd love to open it up to a discussion with all of you, because I know KPFK draws such a unique audience of dedicated people, engaged citizens and activists. We live in dangerous times, already in the grip of post-9/11 state of emergency with no foreseeable end, and the constant military conflicts and vast surveillance umbrella that comes with it. We now confront terror in the streets of Paris, along with the inevitable militant calls for more of the same. More airstrikes, more remote control assassinations, more police state repression, more boots on the ground in that repulsive, dehumanizing expression favored by armchair generals on CNN and Fox News. These extreme measures have been employed by the hardline elements who have taken control of Western democracies for the past 15 years. And the situation on the ground in the Middle East is more of a mess than ever. The only ones who benefit from this constant cycle of violence known as the war on terror are the most extreme hardline elements in Western societies and the Islamic world. In our country, the constant shocks and awes to the system, like the escalation of bombing in Syria or the Paris terror attacks, mostly benefit the military-industrial complex.
Right.
The stock value of weapons manufacturers we heard today is skyrocketed. And the mouthpieces for the war lobby get their 24/7 media showcase, with endless ranks of former spooks and generals and self-proclaimed terror experts with cushy gigs at Washington security foundations marching through the studios of CNN and Fox News screaming for more blood.
Right.
Professional warmongers like this are not new. Back in the Cold War, the great sociologist who's featured in my book, C. Wright Mills, described them this way, quote, "For the first time in American history, men in authority are talking about an emergency without foreseeable end. Such men as these are crackpot realists. In the name of realism, they've constructed a paranoid reality all of their own," end quote. These days, amid all the cries for more blood and more Orwellian security, all talk of diplomacy, of cultural understanding, or historical context is forbidden. We don't hear about the preemptive bombing, and preemptives in quotes, that France launched in Syria days before the Paris terror attacks, or France's ongoing air war in Iraq, or the war that France has been waging in Islamic Africa for the past 3 years. We don't hear about the origins of the Islamic State and how it's led by former military officers of Saddam Hussein, and is therefore a legacy of the Bush-Cheney neoconservative policy of breaking Iraq and the Middle East into pieces so they could rebuild it according to some grand master plan of their own. And of course, we don't hear about the reign of terror and violence that the US government itself has unleashed on Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and elsewhere. What can you call the latest US atrocity? The recent bombing of the Doctors Without Borders hospital in Afghanistan, except an act of terror or a war crime? What can you call the continued operation of Guantanamo and the so-called CIA black sites and the extra-legal drone assassination campaign vastly expanded by President Obama and his CIA? What could you call this if not a reign of official terror, in violation of international law and human rights and all sense of human decency? In fact, the US-led war on terror is itself the biggest generator of terror in the world. It is, to use the latest post-Paris media buzzword, nothing less than barbarism. Why do they hate us? The media once again asks in utter bewilderment. And once again they answer with inanities, like they hate us for our freedom.
Hate us for our clothes.
And that too, because the truth is too raw for us to process, apparently. The truth is they hate us for our violence. They hate us for our imperial arrogance, for our racism, and for our utter cluelessness about why they hate us. It's the job of the American people and the people of France and of Europe, with their country's long history of colonialism and imperialism in the Middle East, not to be clueless. Now more than ever, we need to educate ourselves and to confront our leaders and to demand the truth. The war on terror is a racket, and it has created an unending chain of violence, a perpetual war machine that has created more enemies than it's eliminated, and that has empowered and enriched the most dangerous and destructive forces in our societies. Meanwhile, the rest of us have been forced to pay for this perpetual war machine with our tax dollars, our blood, and our freedoms. It's time to break this chain of violence and ignorance. So let's begin tonight by shedding a light on the rise of America's secret government, the backstory to everything that we're grappling with today. This is largely hidden history, lost in all the compulsory patriotism and the American sniper and Zero Dark 30 propaganda. But we must know the true imperial history of America. As Orwell told us in 1984, those who would control the future control the past. In my book, The Devil's Chessboard, I've told the story of secret government in America by telling the story of Alan Welsh Dulles, the father of modern US intelligence, and perhaps the most ruthless practitioner of power that the American elite has ever produced. Torture, extraordinary rendition, CIA black sites, extra-legal assassinations, mass surveillance of private citizens, the overthrow of democratic governments, subversion of allies. This catalog of criminal policies all began under the long regime of Alan Dulles, not after 9/11. The truth is, Alan Dulles hated the democracies of Iran, Guatemala, and Congo for their freedom. And he terminated these democracies through force. We're still reaping the bitter fruit of these coups and the long reigns of violence, corruption, and extremism that these coups produced. You can't go around the world defying the law and violently imposing your will on sovereign nations without ultimately provoking vicious backlashes, as we just saw in Paris and will continue to see as long as the West feels that its asymmetry of power gives it the right to do whatever it pleases outside the rule of international law. This global arrogance defined the Dulles era, when Alan ran America's growing spy complex, overthrowing governments around the world and assassinating nationalist leaders who got in America's way. Meanwhile, Alan's brother, John Foster Dulles, used his perch as Secretary of State to wield the nuclear club and threaten any country that challenged US authority with extinction. During the Dulles reign, even steadfast allies like France were not safe from the aggressive interference of US security machinery. As I reveal in my book, in April 1961, and there are two researchers, by the way, here who are fluent in French who helped me with this research, and I welcome them here, Francoise and Rhoda, thank you very much. As I reveal in my book, in April 1961, as newly inaugurated President John F. Kennedy grappled with the fallout from one CIA fiasco, the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, JFK was suddenly thrust into another international crisis, the attempted overthrow of President Charles de Gaulle in France. While trying to peacefully conclude the colonial war in Algeria, a bitter and bloody process that included terrorism on both sides, and puts our contemporary troubles in perspective, de Gaulle suddenly faced a coup attempt by right-wing French generals based in Algeria. a coup that de Gaulle was convinced was supported by Allen Dulles and the CIA, who resented de Gaulle's stubborn nationalism and feared that Algerian independence would lead to Soviet control of North Africa's oil reserves. While trying to reassure the French president that he personally did not support the coup, President Kennedy was put in the extremely awkward position of explaining to Paris that he could not speak for his own CIA, that he was in fact not in control of his own government. The limits of his own power were brought home again and again to President John Kennedy and his top aides, including historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a special advisor to JFK, who told me in an interview, quote, "We did not control the Pentagon, nor clearly the CIA." A remarkable statement from someone who served in a Democratic administration. Democratic with a small d. Dulles had a long history of defying presidents going back to Franklin Roosevelt, as I write in my book, in whom he disobeyed by cutting a separate peace deal with Nazi forces while serving as the top American spy in continental Europe during World War II. But the Dulles sabotage of the Kennedy presidency was particularly egregious. Even after JFK fired him in November 1961, Dulles didn't get the memo. He simply went home to Georgetown, where he continued to operate as if he was still running the CIA, meeting with his top deputies and pursuing intelligence policies that ran counter to Kennedy's efforts to defuse the Cold War. This came home for me recently. I was reminded when I saw the film Bridge of Spies, the Steven Spielberg film. How many people have seen that? Good number. So it tells the story of the citizen diplomat, James Donovan, who courageously went to Berlin and helped rescue or free the downed U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers in return for a Soviet spy. The person who's kind of left on the cutting room floor in this story is President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, both of whom encouraged this citizens' diplomacy as a way of starting to moderate the Cold War and nuclear tensions. Kennedy, we're told at the end of the film in a crawl, again used Donovan to go down to Cuba to negotiate the release of the 1,100 Bay of Pigs prisoners who were still being held by Castro, which he did successfully. And in the course of that, Jim Donovan, who was liked his drink, like most of us Irishmen, and liked to talk long into the night, hit it off with Castro, who liked the same. And they formed a kind of good friendship. And so Kennedy suggested that Jim Donovan keep going down to Havana and keep talking to Castro to see if they could expand upon the success of the prisoner release and establish a new peace, a peaceful understanding with Castro. Before he undertook one of these journeys to Havana, the CIA found out about it. The CIA was not in support of this Kennedy policy of rapprochement with Havana. And they went to Donovan and said, "Hey, we heard that Castro likes to go scuba diving. Why don't you take this wetsuit to him as a little gift?" And of course, as students of the Church Committee and the revelations about the many attempts to kill Castro by the CIA, that wetsuit was poisoned and was meant to kill Castro. So here's the CIA using a peace emissary from JFK, who's been working hard to develop a breakthrough in relations between U.S. and Cuba, using him as an unwitting assassin. Fortunately for Fidel, Donovan went to Abercrombie and Fitch and bought his own wetsuit for Fidel, and Fidel lived. In fact, he's still with us.
Yeah.
Among those Allen Dulles continued to meet with in so-called retirement after being forced out of office by Kennedy were, in fact, several gung-ho CIA officers involved in the covert war and assassination program against Fidel Castro, like Howard Hunt, who later became infamous for his leading role in the Watergate break-in. Some, like Hunt, were even later tied to the assassination of President Kennedy, either by their own admission or by investigators for the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s and other research. One of the most notorious figures was William Harvey, head of Allen Dulles' assassination team, and another bitter enemy of JFK. Among the evidence I present that connects Allen Dulles to the assassination of the president, I think this is one of the more interesting and new items. This is based on the information from William Harvey's top deputy in Rome. Harvey was pushed out of the Cuba operation by the Kennedy brothers, and as a way of salvaging his career, the CIA transferred him to Rome, where he took over the CIA station in summer of '63. Mark Wyatt, his deputy, thought that he was an alarming character, a very violent guy, kept urging Wyatt, his deputy, to find mafia hitmen who could kill Italian political figures on the left. And later, Wyatt told his grown children, after he retired, that he spotted William Harvey, his boss, on a plane from Rome to Dallas in November of 1963 before the assassination. And when he asked Harvey what he was doing going to Dallas, he was very evasive and said something like, "I'm just going to look around." This is an important piece of information because here you have the man who's the top, essentially, assassin for the CIA, a man who was put in that position by Allen Dulles, flying to Dallas shortly before the assassination of President Kennedy. This is a man who organized assassinations for the CIA. So is it really that much of a stretch to consider that a killing machine that was built by a ruthless spy master like Allen Dulles to kill foreign leaders was then brought home to kill an American president, who was also seen as a national security threat? This is what happens when you empower a security machine to go around the world overthrowing democracy. It ends up by threatening your own democracy at home. And this is what Harry Truman warned us about in December of 1963 in a remarkable op-ed piece that he wrote in the Washington Post shortly after the assassination of President Kennedy. In this, Harry Truman writes that the CIA, which he himself had created in 1947 while president, had grown into essentially a Frankenstein that was not only endangering democracies overseas, but our own democracy at home. Dulles was so threatened by this remarkable piece in the Washington Post that he flew down to Independence, Missouri, where Truman was retired, and leaned on him heavily to retract the article. Truman, of course, was notoriously stubborn and stuck by his guns. So Dulles did the next best thing. He couldn't change the reality. He couldn't change Truman's mind. So he changed the record, which is the way he operated. He wrote a letter to the council of the CIA saying, I just got back from Missouri. I talked to Harry Truman, and you know, he's kind of lost his mind, he basically says. He's senile. He didn't know what he wrote. And so that became sort of the official inside CIA story. Of course, when a man like Allen Dulles concluded someone was a national security threat, this meant he was a threat to powerful private interests whom Dulles represented. Allen Dulles was no rogue agent. He was not some supervillain who single-handedly changed the course of American history. He was part of an elite network, the power elite, as C. Wright Mills called it, the deep state, as we hear it called today. People who felt democracy was too important to be left in the hands of mere people like you and me or our elected representatives. These were men who believed in a state of permanent war and emergency, for it was this constant state of high anxiety that held together the Western alliance, they believed, and reinforced these men's grip on power. There was method to their madness or their crackpot realism. From the Cold War through the War on Terror, we've been forced to live in this mad world ever since. It's a world of constant threats, of violence and reprisals. A world where Newt Gingrich can tell us, as he just did yesterday, that all Europeans now should arm themselves with guns, like the people of Texas.
Oh, God.
And how do you think that would have worked out at the Bataclan Concert Hall in Paris last Friday? An arena packed with armed young concert goers, high on drugs and alcohol and testosterone, spraying bullets everywhere. These times encourage the most lunatic and authoritarian thinking. The neocon's favorite Muslim refugee, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, tells Western countries we must now militarize our societies like Israel. Former CIA Director James Woolsey screams for the blood of whistleblowers, the last thin line of heroism that protects our degraded democracy, with Woolsey demanding that Ed Snowden be hung by the neck until dead. Literally. The Wall Street Journal and Fox News demand that Obama lash out, even if blindly, but the president, in his words, still refuses to, quote, shoot first and aim later, thank God. I wish that this more restrained and courageous President Obama was more in evidence throughout his presidency. And how long will it be before Obama bows to this hardline pressure and does indeed send more troops to Syria and forces Silicon Valley to unlock the encryption safeguards protecting consumers and political dissidents around the world from abusive regimes and ruthless criminal networks? It's our job as citizens to defend our dying freedoms to our final breath. Democracy is a fragile enterprise, an eggshell in the rough tumble of history. It barely survived 2 centuries in ancient Athens. And throughout its brief history, Athenian democracy itself was constantly undermined by imperial wars abroad and by the forces of oligarchy and tyranny within. Aristocrats organized death squads to kill popular leaders, and despots were constantly plotting to seize power from the people. Unfortunately, this is also the current downward arc of America, a democracy increasingly degraded by imperial adventures and unwinnable wars, the growth of a vast security state, the political rule of the 1%, along with growing poverty, environmental decay, police repression, and public fear and powerlessness. The American people are befogged and benumbed, brainwashed by a media that follows the national security propaganda line when not busy sniffing out celebrity gossip. It's our jobs as investigative historians, as journalists, as bloggers, as engaged citizens, as activists, to break through this bell jar, to wake up the people of America and the West before it's too late, and before the cycle of violence in this age of doomsday weapons spins completely out of control. Sapere aude, the philosopher Horace admonished his fellow citizens during the final years of another empire, dare to know. Or as the Bible tells us in a verse that Alan Dulles, no doubt with some heavy irony, chose as an inscription for the lobby of the new CIA headquarters, you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free.
Oh my God.
Ironic, as I said. Over 50 years ago, at the height of another terrifying period, President John F. Kennedy delivered a speech at American University challenging his fellow citizens to break free from the Cold War grip of fear and hatred. JFK had the enormous courage and vision to ask Americans, after nearly 2 decades of being taught to fear and hate the communist enemy, to instead regard the Russian people as human beings. For in the final analysis, President Kennedy declared, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. We need the same sense of human solidarity and understanding today more than ever, not more of the same blind passions and resentments that have brought the world to this dark and dangerous place. Thank you very much.
All right.